morning, everybody. Welcome to day 2 and panel number 4 of this 2-day conference. So in this panel, we'll be talking about the futures of war and the military, so making a real focus on that application. So for those of you that don't know me, I haven't met yet, my name is Katie Woodward. You can tell by the accent, I'm a Brit. I'm here working for the UK Ministry of Defence, seconded to the new NATO Climate Change and Security Centre of Excellence that stood up in Montreal, October 2023. And it's absolutely my pleasure to chair this large panel today of experts who are going to discuss climate, military strategy, and some of those geopolitical implications. And I hope identify a range of challenges and opportunities for us to think about as we look through the military lens. And so without further ado, I'm going to turn to Dr. Duncan Depledge from Loughborough University, who will present some work on what low-carbon warfare means for the Western way of war. Now, Duncan's work here will be presented that he's worked with Tom Hobson, also of Loughborough University. Duncan's been working for several years on the implications of climate change for low-carbon warfare and geopolitics in regions like the Arctic specifically. And he's worked with NATO, governments, international military organisations, and also not afraid of asking the really big questions in those forums. I particularly remember, Duncan, a question you asked maybe 5 years ago. Would Elon Musk's army have tanks? It seems a little bit more kind of relevant today, but you asked that question some time ago. And Tom's work complementing this, particularly on how technology can both shape as well. So very, very interested to see your presentation, Duncan.
All right, brilliant. Well, thank you for that introduction. And before I begin, also, I'd just like to thank Bruno and the organising team for inviting me here for the first time to Montreal to participate in what's been an excellent conference so far. You'll notice that there isn't an error on the title page. It wasn't a mistake. But originally, this paper that I'm working on with my postdoc, Tom Hobson, was going to be about whether the nascent demands of low-carbon warfare as an emergent response to climate change could drive a recommitment to key principles in the so-called Western way of war, defined as the pursuit of rapid, precise, and decisive ways of waging war at minimal cost and with minimal collateral harm, or otherwise hasten the demise of that kind of thinking. But over time, as we've been working on this over the past few months, this kind of term, the Western way of war, I think has lost its allure for us. And so the paper, as reflected in the changed title, has instead turned to grapple with questions about how low-carbon warfare might influence what we think of as the future shape of war, and particularly the utility of force in a low-carbon world more generally. So what I'm presenting today is the first draft of the paper. I'll take you through it as best I can, and then look forward to the opportunity to discuss how best to strengthen it. There's 3 contextual aspects just to cover. The first is just to situate this work in the context of the project that I've been running over the past 2 years, the Net Zero Military's Retaining Operational Effectiveness in a Low-Carbon World. Funded by one of the UK's main research councils, the project has been investigating how the UK Ministry of Defence has been assessing and responding to emerging imperatives to markedly reduce fossil fuel consumption within the armed forces over the coming decades, in terms of both the opportunities that that's likely to create and the challenges. This investigation has been based on official documentation, participation in various meetings and events, and interviews and focus groups with over 50 government officials and military personnel. The paper also forms part of this broader effort of mine to understand to what extent militaries might need to develop new concepts, cultures, and capabilities, the 3 C's that make up fighting force of low-carbon warfare in order to operate effectively in a low-carbon world. The starting point for this has always been to, first of all, acknowledge that defence has a carbon problem, based on the fact that the vast quantities of fossil fuels being burned in the name of national security are becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. And we saw that in part yesterday as well with Leonard de Klerk's presentation. Leonard also introduced us to the importance of thinking about military emissions. Emissions from the world's armed forces globally are estimated to constitute somewhere in the region of 3.3 to 7% of global greenhouse gas emissions, so it's not insignificant. Militaries are already investing, and have been for some time, in low-carbon capabilities. You know, it's not actually that unusual to find militaries thinking about how to integrate non-fossil fuel-based energy systems into not just installations, but also into operational capabilities. And low-carbon warfare is also meant to also try to push us away from thinking in terms of greening defense. The whole point of low-carbon warfare is how do you operate with fewer fossil fuels. It's not necessarily about being gentle on the environment or solving the bigger problem of climate change. So instead, low-carbon warfare, as I kind of conceptualize it, is about what happens to the shape of war if militaries can no longer rely on fossil fuels. The final piece of the context is the empirical work that we've been doing to understand how military decarbonisation is being conceptualised, particularly within the UK, but I think the UK is emblematic of how a lot of NATO allies and partners have been approaching this subject. And I'm happy to discuss this more afterwards in questions, but the initial findings of that, which are kind of relevant to what we're trying to do in this paper, is that most of this agenda still seems to be explicitly tied to thinking about offensive forms of warfare rather than defensive forms of warfare. And the significance of this will hopefully become clear by the end of this presentation. So this is a slightly odd question to ask, but do fossil fuels dependencies have stopping power? What do I mean by this? Well, the idea is really drawn from something that has been popularized in strategic studies for quite some time, which talks about the stopping power of water. And this is essentially the idea that historically the challenge of crossing large bodies of water, especially oceans, has posed significant constraints on the ability of states to engage in offensive military actions across vast distances. However, more recent work by another British academic who works in strategic studies called David Blagden has argued that to avoid a kind of a sense of geographical determinism about this, we need to marry this understanding of how geography sort of influences the ability to wage offensive wars with the interaction that has with technology. Simply put, the salience of water as a barrier to offensive action is conditional on there not being technological solutions to essentially overcome it. And we can look at other kinds of geographies as well. It's not just about water. So David Blagden points to these examples, for instance, in Vietnam, where American sort of technological superiority founded in the jungle, or examples from the mountains of Afghanistan, or even, given the sort of more recent interest in urban warfare, how cities are environments where militaries find it very difficult to leverage their superior technologies. So there's all kinds of environmental conditions that matter to the ability to engage in different kinds of warfare, and these are wholly conditioned by the availability of technologies to potentially overcome that. So historically, it's technology that's been used to overcome geographical friction, but now the pressures of the climate crisis are really bringing many of these technological gains into question, not least because when we think about things like heavily armored vehicles, warships, conventional aircraft, so fast jets, wide-bodied jets, we're talking about capabilities that have really been developed off the back of fossil fuels. So we have a whole suite of offensive capabilities that are critically dependent on fossil fuels that are now looking potentially more difficult to use if and when access to using those fossil fuels become more constrained. So in short, context is critical. That's what I'm trying to say here. And it's critical to understanding under what conditions those kind of capabilities, which are key to being able to engage in offensive action, actually become possible. So what's of concern here is the balance between offensive capabilities and defensive capabilities. And what the offense-defense balance concept from strategic studies teaches us is that what matters is the relative ease of attack and defense given other prevailing conditions. Now, in the past, this has been used to think about whether or not this can independently determine whether states go to war, but following Blagden's kind of version of this, what's interesting to me is how this operates more as a kind of an intervening variable that affects the calculations that states make about the utility of force under certain conditions. So ultimately, the decision to go to war will remain a political one and is not determined by the existence of kind of objectively favorable conditions for one form of war or another. And other factors are going to matter as well. So while the conditions may favor the possibility of engaging in certain forms of offensive warfare, that doesn't necessarily mean you've got the resource and the capacity to actually do it. So there's a lot more to consider. But essentially, claims that when the broader context conspires to make operation, essentially what we're trying to get across here is this claim that when the broader context conspires to make offensive operations easier, because the defenses of an adversary can be overwhelmed at relatively low cost, the use of force as an instrument of power becomes more attractive. Conversely, when the broader context conspires to make offensive operations more difficult, states are likely to reach for the military instrument. So what does this look like in a low-carbon future? And I invite you to take a bit of a speculative leap here with me to think about a world of deepening climate crisis and major changes in a global energy landscape, and whether this makes this kind of fossil fuel-based defensive capability harder or easier to wield. So the first question we have to ask to answer this question is what constraints would be put on the use of military force in this world? And I would suggest that capabilities that rely heavily on fossil fuels will become harder to operate and sustain on the battlefield. This, as I said, tends to describe those capabilities that are defined by weight and by speed, so especially heavily armored vehicles, warships, conventional aircraft. And such capabilities are critically important for offensive operations, which depend on the ability to mobilize rapid and overwhelming firepower wherever the enemy is weakest, with the aim of punching through the lines and bringing about the collapse of their forces. Now, such capabilities can, of course, also make significant contributions to defensive operations, but they're not quite as critical. There are other ways to survive and endure and to ultimately win wars. And the history of counterinsurgency tells us that you do not necessarily need masses of tanks and planes and warships to be able to defend yourself. So in the face of overwhelming firepower, defenders are more likely to disperse, they're more likely to hide, engage in forms of guerrilla warfare that aim to bleed the attacker's will and capacity to fight. Ultimately, then, defense is less reliant than offense on the capabilities that are particularly difficult to decarbonize. Can low-carbon technology overcome these constraints? Well, some technological solutions, drop-in fuels, so synthetic aviation fuels, for example, already exist, but the problem is they cannot be scaled up at sufficient scale at affordable cost, and significant barriers are going to remain to being able to do that. Other kinds of technology and energy systems are less energy dense and more difficult to store, and their uptake was bound to come with trade-offs for speed, mass, range of the kind of capabilities you're deploying. So it seems that low-carbon technology currently, without a major revolution, is not going to be able to overcome the constraints that this is going to put on offensive operations. Conversely, though, many of the advantages that are being touted for low-carbon technology are actually more related to the ability to disperse, to hide, to be self-sufficient for longer. So again, this would suggest a tendency towards favoring defensive operations. So when offensive maneuver operations become less difficult, offensive maneuver kind of dies on the battlefield, essentially. And in a low-carbon future, fossil fuel dependencies are likely to increasingly restrict the ease of offensive maneuvers. And what we learned from people like Amos Fox is that once mobility stalls on the battlefield, wars generally become more costly, more protracted, more attritional, and this reduces the allure of battle, suggesting that the threshold for the use of military force will rise. Allure is, after all, conditional on the prospect that wars can be won swiftly, precisely, and decisively. And we're already seeing that contemporary trends in war, and many of the lessons that have been taken out of Ukraine by certain military thinkers, already point to this kind of death of maneuver, if you will. It's becoming much, much harder to move freely on the battlefield, to mass force, to be able to engage in those kind of offensive operations. And the suggestion, I would say, is that transitioning away from fossil fuels is only going to hasten this demise. So drawing this to sort of some sort of tentative conclusion and think about the implications. The main aim that I'm trying to achieve with this work is really to just challenge this assumption, dominant particularly among Western militaries, I think, that the problem of low-carbon warfare is one of finding technological solutions to fossil fuel dependencies that threaten to constrain the ability to deploy decisive and overwhelming offensive force on the battlefield. So we have this mono-focus on offensive capability rather than thinking more widely about what else we can learn from thinking about low-carbon warfare. A turn towards low-carbon warfare, I would suggest, is actually more likely to exacerbate the kinds of concerns, the kind of challenges that militaries are facing on the battlefield in Ukraine when it comes to engaging in offensive operations than it is to ameliorate them. So the prospect is that decarbonisation is actually going to kill rather than sustain manoeuvre needs to be taken seriously, especially if adversaries are looking to take advantage of those who feel the carbon costs of war more heavily. Fighting a defensive war requires very different ways of thinking about how to survive, endure, and ultimately exhaust and outlast an aggressor's will and capacity to fight. And history suggests that this is not something that Western military forces, with their preference for offensive forms of fighting, have really thought about very much. And so concepts of low-carbon warfare, I'd argue, that are focused on defensive warfighting are in danger of being overlooked at the moment. We're spending so much time thinking about how do we sustain our ability to kind of engage in offensive operations that we're not paying enough attention to thinking, well, actually, what if the future requirements of Western military force are actually going to be far more about how they engage in defensive forms of warfare? And in those kind of struggles, how can low-carbon technology potentially be leveraged? At the end of the day, even if the West decides not to go down that route, it's bound to teach us something about other potential adversaries who might try to exploit low-carbon technology in that way. So it seems worth exploring either way. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you. And to get revolution in the first comment of the second day, I think is an excellent place also to hand to Dr. Anselm Vogler, non-resident fellow at the Institute for Peace Research and Security Policy and postdoctoral researcher at Harvard University. So many of you will be familiar with Anselm's work, looking at how climate change is reshaping security thinking, and particularly at that kind of national and defence level. So we're very eager to hear your thoughts as you address the production of climate mobility futures. Over to you, thank you.
Thank you very much, Katie, for the very nice introduction, and I'm also seconding Duncan in expressing gratitude to Bruno and his team for organizing this wonderful conference, this nice format of bringing together practitioners, professionals, researchers, etc. It's really fascinating to be here, and I'm glad that I can share some insights into my current research, which is focused on the production of climate mobility futures. I should just clarify or avoid the misunderstanding that this is about mobility in a sense of migration. So this means it's about how people move. There is this argument in migration studies that one should rather talk about mobility instead of migration. This is not about military mobility, which is of course also a really important issue. And today I'm presenting comparative insights from a few national security strategies. And I won't be telling you, I won't surprise you when I emphasize that addressing issues at the climate security nexus is really a challenge in itself and requires us to embrace complexity and to stay humble in terms of making sense of the world outside. And one way where we can see that is the differentiation between direct and indirect impacts. We can think of climate security being challenged by heat waves, by floods, by extreme weather events, but of course also by indirect events that arise when societies or communities or governments or other institutions respond to these direct impacts. And among those are involuntary immobility, entrapment. There is an argument about scarcity-related conflicts or how climate-related events affect already ongoing conflicts. And of course, there is this debate about the impact of climate change on migration. And one message that really comes up time and again in research is that policy really matters when responding, not only in responding, but also in shaping the way in which climate-related insecurities manifest or won't manifest. And therefore, policy design is really crucial, and there is this argument that policy design in turn is affected heavily by policy framing, by problem definitions, by how we understand the problem, where we put our focus will affect how we respond to that, and that in turn shapes the future. Therefore, framing really matters, and even more so, this is important because misguiding or even unjustified claims or problem framings can also misguide policy design. So framing, again, really matters, and this also holds true for climate-related mobility. It is not an easy issue, climate-related migration. We see, for example, the IPCC 6th assessment report stating that there are, I quote, few documented examples of long-distance interregional, my addition, this is referring to international, I continue, migration driven by climate events. Gabriel Daoud, together with Jan Selby, last year published a brilliant review of the research that's out there on the nexus between climate change and mobility or migration. And they also emphasize how there is mixed evidence on short-term migration after shock events, and I'm quoting from the paper, long-term climatic and related changes, unquote, might be most significant, but then again, quote, there is little evidence of its impacts so far, unquote. And then finally, quote, unquote, methodological shortcomings and dubious projections, unquote, prevail. So really, again, research tells us we have to be conscious and careful when we talk about climate-related mobility to get the phenomenon right. Boas et al., 2022, it is in most cases empirically impossible to distinguish between climate and non-climate migrants. Gilmore et al., 2024, both climate-related mobility and immobility can be voluntary and involuntary. And that, I only brought these quotes to show that really we need to be conscious when we address this topic, and therefore a foresighted, sustainable, comprehensive climate security policy should also arguably move beyond narrow reactive responses that focus on securing borders in preparation for possible future climate migrants, which might actually not be a thing, or whether they become a thing internationally depends also on how we shape the world today. And therefore, arguably, framings are required to move us towards comprehensive responses grounded in a conscious problem framing. And therefore, I had a look at the related literature to bring a few points that seem relevant. This is work in progress, and I'm really happy about your feedback. Maybe I've missed something, but anyways, I would argue it seems recommendable to consider the diversity of forms of mobility when talking about, or when framing the issue of climate mobility. There is temporary migration, there's permanent migration, there's multi-stage migration, seasonal migration, etc. So very different forms of mobility. Empirically, we are seeing evidence that there is much more internal than international migration in different forms, displacement, voluntary, etc., urbanization. So being conscious about the different sort of scales at which mobility and migration unfold. And as we have seen on the previous slide, it seems advisable to avoid or at least qualify claims about international climate-related mobility. And of course, again, put migration, climate-related migration, into the context of other drivers of migration and mobility, because it's not happening in a vacuum if it happens. Normatively, there is good evidence that migrants are at risk when they migrate due to climate impacts, of course, and if they are displaced from an area, maybe due to livelihood loss, they're also in a precarious position, not all, but in many cases, so that their own well-being is at risk. And highlighting that is also, seems also conducive to comprehensive policy responses. And also, it seems advisable to avoid an exclusively negative reactive tonality and to acknowledge, again, ambiguity. And together, also, research has debated and suggested the extent to which mobility can be a means of climate adaptation. Another aspect that's important in research and that might also be useful to inform policy framings. So I was curious to see where foreign and security policies around the world are currently at. And so I looked at national security strategies to study how they refer to mobility and also to climate-related mobility more specifically. I looked at national security strategies published since 2017. That, of course, meant a limited geographical scope. But I think, or at least I hope, I've covered all documents out there since 2017. If you see a country missing, please approach me afterwards. So this does not speak about the world in total, of course, and it also does not speak about the governments completely, but it only speaks about what they are willing to put into their official foreign and security policy statements. And we see that all colored countries are those who are included in my sample, and we see that they all refer in one or another form to mobility, either in form of immigration or emigration or both. And you see only Iceland in the North Atlantic and Samoa in the Pacific being shaded in dark gray. Those are the countries who do not mention migration in their strategies. So it's a very common issue, of course, in foreign and security policies. And it's a little less common to talk about climate-related mobility. It's only those countries now shaded in green that cover the issue. Other countries avoid it. And as you can see, it's not very common in those countries from the included that are from beyond the global West, which does not suggest that it's not a matter in their policy. It's just not prominent in the national security strategies. And this could be, of course, for a variety of reasons. Now, the next slide shows even less countries in green, and those are the countries that provide reasons for a claimed relation between climate change and mobility. And dark gray are those countries that refer to a climate migration link, but do not deliver a causal model. And I've looked into this, and the direct pathways are more common than the indirect pathways. So 5 times, respectively 6 times, countries either refer to climate change or sea level rise or other disasters affecting habitability or causing resource loss, and that in turn would lead to migration. And only 3 countries, I guess that's good news, because in this narrowness, the frame would otherwise be probably problematic. Only 3 times countries refer to an indirect pathway, climate change, causing scarcity conflicts, and that would sort of trigger migration. I'm not saying this phenomenon does not exist, but one does not give justice to it by narrating it in that short wording. So, and now to the question of other drivers. How does references to climate-related migration fare against other seen drivers of mobility? And here the bar chart outlines references for countries from the global West, which are defined as being members in NATO, European Union, or OECD, at least one of them. And the global South is countries who are not member in any of those international organizations, but have also not opted for a clearly sort of antagonistic policy against those nations. And we can see a clear dominance of economic reasons, or linkages to economic migration, but then climate migration is a close second. So this really shows the idea of climate-related migration is taking up track in international strategies. References to migrant well-being, on the other hand, are not as common, and so a lot of countries refer to climate-related migration without sort of pointing to the well-being of those who are put at risk by climate change. Tonality is also ambiguous. In blue color indicates those countries that are referring to mobility in ambiguous ways. Orange are those countries that are more or exclusively focused on negative impacts of migration in their strategies. I'm wrapping up. So this is, again, a wrap-up. I haven't covered all aspects, the forms, the first line, the forms of migration and the prominence or absence of internal migration, but there is a lack of differentiation, and I just left it out of the presentation, but this is another concern, that there is not enough differentiation and also references to internal displacement in these security strategies. So taken together, I find from the 50 countries' national security strategies that governments use national security strategy documents to construct mobility futures, but they arguably lack a differentiation regarding the forms of migration. The references to migrant well-being are not frequent in the global West and even less common in the global South, which again only points to the strategies. I'm not suggesting that this is a sort of dominant position within the policy of different countries. Tonality related to migration is mostly negative, focused on concerns, and at the same time, thoughts about endorsing climate-related mobility as a means of climate adaptation is not present in these strategies, and therefore now finding a way back to the future of operations and of policy. I would argue that national security strategies frame climate mobility futures in concerningly symptom-oriented, reactive ways that are not reflecting the state of research and that might justify counterproductive future operations. Thank you very much.
Excellent, thank you. And taking from that sort of problem framings and that international view, we'll pass now to Professor Tanisha Fazal from the University of Minnesota, recently named the 2025 Distinguished McKnight Professor, recognising her outstanding contribution to research, but also more recently turning focus to how climate change is challenging the foundations of international relations. Alongside Professor Paige Fortna from Columbia University, a leading expert on the durability of peace after war, as they both present their paper on how it affects the global power structures. And so in their presentation, Power Shifts in the Anthropocene. So thank you, over to you.
Thanks. So I'll start, give about half of the presentation, and then I'll turn it over to Nisha. In this paper, we're trying to answer a question, a very big, broad question: how will climate change affect power in the international system? And we think about this both in terms of how climate change might affect the components of power, and here we're focused primarily as a starting point on kind of hard material forms of power, and then also how will those changes in the components of power then lead to possible changes in the distribution of power. And the paper is very forward-looking, and so it's really raising questions more than answering them about a very uncertain future. And one of the many forms of uncertainty is that we don't know what climate future we are facing. And so we think about kind of the spectrum of possible climate outcomes as ranging from a climate catastrophe world in which the world fails to mitigate emissions, and we end up with over 5 degrees warming by the end of the century and continuing warming after that, a climate catastrophe scenario. And then at the very far end of the spectrum of possible outcomes is a world of very rapid decarbonization to curb emissions, perhaps overshooting 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius, but then bringing temperatures back below that. The actual outcome will be somewhere in the middle, as my colleague will discuss toward the end of the presentation, but as a framing device, we think about the effects of these two very different kind of boundary scenarios to try to think through the implications for power in the world. And so, traditionally speaking, international relations scholars who are focusing on hard material power think about it in 3 buckets. Think about economic power, demographic power, and military power. So in the paper, we go through not a comprehensive list, but we try to raise some of the possible implications of these 2 boundary scenarios for each of these buckets. And in the interest of time, I'm not going to go through everything we talk about in the paper, and everything we talk about in the paper isn't everything that there is to talk about in these buckets. But for the purposes of this presentation, I thought I would just highlight a few things that maybe haven't come up in the discussion so far. So we know that climate change and the climate catastrophe scenario, the red part of the table here, we know that there will be massive effects on economic output, agriculture, et cetera, so that will affect economic power of states. We also have reason to believe that climate catastrophe will affect demography in several ways. Mortality rates will go up. Complex relationship with fertility, migration, as we just heard about, a very complex set of things that will may happen in a climate catastrophe scenario. And then on the direct military, well, first on indirect, both the economic and the demographic components will then affect military power because you have to pay for and staff militaries. But then there are likely implications of climate catastrophe for military infrastructure, for military effectiveness, and then as we were just hearing about, kind of the defensive geography of the world may change with climate change. For example, if mud seasons become much longer, that might increase the stopping power of mud. On the other hand, if riverbeds dry up, that reduces the stopping power of rivers. Perhaps of particular importance to Canada and also to Russia, if the Arctic melts, then large coastlines of those countries become harder to defend. On the other scenario, in the rapid decarbonization scenario, we can also think through implications. On the economic side, there'll be shifts in fossil fuels becoming stranded assets, critical resources for green energy becoming more important, but very interesting, nuanced things going on in that realm. The demographic effects are likely to be smaller than the demographic effects of a climate catastrophe scenario, but there are still some interesting things to think about through there. And then in a decarbonized military, as Duncan was saying, there'll be very interesting implications for military power in a truly decarbonized world. And just to pick up on, just to sort of add to what Duncan was saying, one of the things that we're starting to think through is whether if to the extent that a decarbonized world is relying more on nuclear power, are there connections between nuclear power and in terms of energy generation and nuclear weapons, which could affect the balance of power? And so then we turn from that to think about the distribution of power. And so I'll say a word about the distribution of power under the climate catastrophe scenario, and then I'll hand it over to Tanisha. So there's a huge amount of uncertainty. That's really one of the main themes of this paper, is that there's a great deal of uncertainty in all of these things, and the sort of uncertainty compounding upon each other. But one thing that seems fairly clear is that on a large scale, in very general terms, the distribution of power, a climate catastrophe scenario will exacerbate the already existing inequalities between the global north and the global south. The global south, on average, will get hit first and worst, and so power will be diminished more in the global south relative to the global north. Then turning to think about great power competition, thinking about the United States-China relationship, which of course is very much on the mind of US policymakers and Chinese policymakers, I presume. The latitude of the two countries is relatively similar, and so in a kind of gross sense, the overall economic effects may be roughly similar. China has a much larger population that is vulnerable to sea level rise, and so something that has been a component of sort of positive component of power, having many, many people, could in fact turn into a vulnerability if many of those people are vulnerable to sea level rise or other climate impacts. The Chinese Navy is much newer than the US Navy, so the naval infrastructure presumably has been built with a sense of the need for resilience to sea level rise, more so than the aging US naval structure. On the other hand, the reliance of China on artificial islands, by definition low-level, low-lying and vulnerable to sea level rise, could affect the naval capacity of China. Turning to Russia, Russia appears to believe that it will benefit from climate change, if not in absolute terms. We don't think anybody will benefit from a climate catastrophe, but in relative terms, they seem to think that they will do better relative to the rest of the world because of their northern latitude, increased agricultural production. On the other hand, there's quite a bit of vulnerability especially of their military infrastructure, to permafrost melt. The Arctic opening up will open up economic opportunities, but as I mentioned, also defensive vulnerabilities.
Be a little bit more optimistic and talk about what might happen to the distribution of power in a decarbonized world, so the other boundary scenario that we're looking at. And I'll talk about it in a few ways. First is with respect to the balance of power between the US and China. And here, we really agree with something that Bruno mentioned yesterday, which is that China clearly has the edge economically here in terms of their access, having secured access to the raw materials necessary for a renewables-based economy, and also having the capacity to turn those raw materials into goods like electric vehicles and solar panels. The US probably maybe has the advantage in terms of green defense, but sorry, Duncan, we're a little bit skeptical about whether armies would ever really fully decarbonize, so we're not sure how much of an advantage that really is. The other set of issues where, we in some ways have maybe a little bit more confidence in talking about in terms of the distribution of power in a decarbonized world has to do with the geopolitics of the energy transition, especially the economics of it, where we know that in a fully decarbonized world, petrostates, for example, countries in the Middle East whose economies really depend on the export of fossil fuels, will be the holders of stranded assets. And so these petrostates are going to experience a lot of domestic instability, and regions of the world like the Middle East, which have really been a geopolitical center of gravity, will no longer have that central role in terms of global politics. This doesn't necessarily mean, though, that countries that have the raw materials necessary for a renewables-based economy end up substituting for them perfectly, for at least two reasons. First, fossil fuels need to flow constantly in order for a fossil fuel-based economy. And the way in which something like lithium works, it's not quite the same, because you mine the lithium, you make the battery, you put it in the car. You don't need, it's more of a sunk cost economic model. You don't need that constant flow in quite the same way. And second, the way the technology is changing it's changing so rapidly that there is kind of a boom and bust cycle with a lot of these raw materials. We don't necessarily need cobalt anymore in order to make certain batteries, or even lithium. And so some of these countries might have kind of short-term booms, but they're not necessarily going to sustain or last in the long term. All right, so Paige previewed a little bit that we also want to say a few words about what might happen in the middle between these boundary scenarios, because probably that's where we're going to end up. It's obviously a really big range, and so there's really a lot of uncertainty here. But a few points we want to make is that in this middle, or any of these middle scenarios, you're dealing with both the effects of climate change, but also the transition to decarbonization. And so for countries in the global south in particular, they're really going to have to, they're trying to navigate this very difficult path. You can think about a country like Guyana, which has a pretty significant carbon sink that it wants to maintain, but also very significant climate adaptation needs, and is funding its climate adaptation by drilling for oil and using the oil proceeds. Or you can think about a country like Chile, which has significant lithium stores and is in the process of extracting that lithium, creating further environmental degradation. We can probably be a little bit more confident in talking about the Arctic, which I know is something that's going to be discussed tomorrow as well. In that, in this middle scenario, you probably get, or you do get, continued melting, and so opening up of shipping lanes, which improves access to fossil fuels, or any fossil fuel deposits in the Arctic, but also access to any resources that would be necessary for a renewables-based economy. So either way, the Arctic becomes a real hotbed, if you'll pardon the pun, area of the world. And one topic that we were a little bit surprised, and it didn't come up yesterday, that we think will actually become more important in this boundary, but in this middle scenario in particular, is geoengineering, especially solar geoengineering. So we're not advocating for solar geoengineering, but we do think that it's important to think through the ways in which the deployment of solar geoengineering could affect the distribution of power, which will depend on who's deploying it, what kind of solar geoengineering is used, and what the effects of that deployment would be, which we don't know, because this is a technology that's really barely experimental, and also whether it could be weaponized. All right, so let me just close by sharing with you our mantra for this project, which is this quote that comes from either Niels Bohr or Yogi Berra, who, if you don't know, is a US baseball player and also a pretty famous humorist, which is that it's very difficult to predict, especially the future, and so we are really trying to lean into the uncertainty. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you very much. and really getting that kind of technology piece as well. It's a perfect pivot again to Emil Havstrup, who is a research fellow at Clingendael, specialising in geopolitical and security implications of climate change, and speaks widely about climate and diplomacy. And will present some work alongside Benjamin Saundry, who's an independent researcher who's been looking at how military technologies and climate change relate. So we welcome your presentation that's going to look at how climate change and drone usage both shape one another. Over to you.
Thank you, Katie. First of all, I'd like to thank Bruno and his team for organizing the event. It's fantastic to be here and share the project that me and Ben are working on. What we are essentially looking at is unmanned aerial vehicles in modern warfare operations. There is sort of a developing phenomena and a trend that they are becoming more prevalent, more in use, alongside another emerging trend, that of climate change. And we want to look at these two different phenomena and how they impact and interact with one another, how unmanned aerial vehicles might be affected by a changing climate, and in turn how the production and use of UAVs in combat settings might impact the global climate. So I'm working on this together with my colleague Benjamin, who unfortunately is not able to be here today, so I'll be presenting on our behalf. To introduce sort of the idea behind the topic, we're really looking at the increased prevalence of unmanned aerial vehicles, especially first-person view UAVs in combat settings. Especially these smaller first-person view FPV UAVs are becoming more popular due to the low barriers of entry for their use. They're very cheap to produce and they're quite easy to use. It's easy to train someone to use a controller to fly one of these things. For this reason, we're also limiting the scope of, or we've chosen to limit the scope of this paper and study to FPV UAVs. This is mainly because there's more information about it. It's also a very growing trend. They're also vastly different from their much larger counterparts, Class 3 drones, Predator drones, etc. And simultaneously, we're looking at how climate change as a phenomenon are challenging how armed forces operate on a global scale, sort of the effects that climate change has on armed forces and how it forces them to adapt to changing circumstances. Shifting climatic conditions may impact how UAVs are deployed. They will in turn also have UAVs will in turn also have an impact on the global climate through their production, their use, and their disposal or not disposal. So we investigate what impacts could emerge from this relationship, how they might affect one another, and how this could be accounted for in future procurement planning and operations. And by doing so, we really want to contribute to the wider body of literature on military climate relations and effects, really discussing sort of both an adaptation perspective but also a mitigation perspective on this. And to do so, we have a combined methodological approach that includes a systematic literature review combined with a life cycle assessment to support it. We make use of a PRISMA framework, which is a very useful framework for selecting texts based on a series of eligibility criteria in order to categorize them and provide a solid overview of current developments. And we've done this to sort of contextualize the two trends towards one another to sort of see how they intertwine and impact one another. In doing so, we've set sort of an objective for this systematic literature review to sort of guide it. The objective of the review is to determine what impact climate change and drone usage for combat operations have on one another. And by doing so, we hope to provide sort of a solid overview of these two developments and then use a life cycle assessment to dive deep and provide more nuanced and more targeted assessments and analysis on this. And to sort of guide the framework, we've set two guiding questions for this process. The first one being, how might climate change impact the usage of unmanned aerial vehicles during combat operations? And the second one being, what impact does the use of unmanned aerial vehicles have on the environment? For the purpose of this review, we've considered peer-reviewed articles, reports, policy papers, etc., that are published by academic journals, defense colleges, national governments, international organizations, and non-governmental organizations. And for this process, we've sort of set up a search string that includes keywords and Boolean operators to sort of provide a comprehensive overview and access to a lot of the literature that deals with these topics. Afterwards, these papers are being extracted to a Excel arc where they're cataloged according to designated metrics that we defined, and these vary from anything from the date published and the name of the author to how they relate to either or both of the guiding questions that we've set ourselves. And then after this review is completed, and part of it is to then do this life cycle assessment where we take the results from the review and sort of apply it in a life cycle assessment framework. Life cycle assessments are incredibly useful for looking at sort of the cradle to grave of a product or service and really specific effects throughout the whole life cycle of a product. Our analysis and approach from this life cycle assessment actually builds on a recent publication on measuring the environmental impact of the use of concrete walls in Iraq by the US Department of Defense. They provide a quite robust framework that we're making use of to sort of categorize and set up different stages that we will analyze more in depth. And these 5 distinct stages that we've sort of divided the life cycle assessment up into are: 1, material extraction, where we look at what materials are actually needed as inputs for an FPV drone. The second one being the refinement of these materials and the assembly of input goods, so sort of a camera or a warhead or a battery. The third one being the assembly of the drones themselves, so the transportation and the final assembly of the drone. Fourth, the use during combat operations, how the drones operate under different climatic conditions, and what effect they have on their immediate environment. And finally, the end of life and their disposal or not disposal and reuse or not reuse. And the idea is really to look at the base materials that go into a drone and the drones themselves throughout their entire life. And as you can see in the diagram on the screen, that's actually quite a lot of different components. Despite their small size, these UAVs are comprised of a wide array of different goods and input tools that vary from anything from carbon fiber frames to batteries to warheads. And it also varies depending on the actual model you're talking about and the purpose of the drone. Is it a recon drone or is it more of a kamikaze drone? And this actually makes it quite difficult to establish more of an overall view of the drones currently in use for warfare operations. I mean, there's over 100 different models in use in Ukraine alone, for example. So it's quite difficult to develop a solid overview of what actually goes into it. But some general trends that we do see in a lot of these drones is that they're often made with materials such as carbon and glass fiber composites, carbon fiber reinforced polymers, aluminium, plastics, camera equipment, small electronics, lithium-ion batteries, and small munitions. What is also very interesting is that in the grand scheme of things, some of these input goods that go into making these FPV drones are actually more carbon intensive than other input goods for more traditional military equipment. I mean, carbon fiber is more carbon intensive and expensive to produce from a CO2 perspective than steel is, for example. So there's also some nuances in how large the carbon footprint from the use of these drones actually is. And some preliminary findings that we have from the analysis, because it's not quite done yet, is that one, climate limited, class 1 drones, these small FPV UAVs, are more likely to be impacted by climate change and have their capabilities limited by climate change. What we see is that these small drones are quite dependent on weather conditions for how they operate. Climate change has the effect that it makes weather patterns more irregular, more unpredictable. This has an impact on how you plan for your operations, the degree of reliability that these drones offer. Additionally, temperatures also impact how you can use these drones. If there's a prolonged period of cold, batteries might be affected, which reduces the range. Simultaneously, if you have a prolonged period of warmth or heat, this makes air less dense and requires more energy to generate lift, which does reduce range, but also increases the amount of energy that's used to perform under the same conditions. The second point is really related to the scale of the drones used for combat operations. The technological developments and the speed of which drones are becoming ever more prevalent and developing on a battlefield will mean that you will need to invest ever more resources to keep up and sort of have a drone arms race in terms of the capabilities that they have and that you can provide, which increases the overall need for materials and energy rather than any reductions that might come from relying more on drones than traditional equipment. The third one is one of evolution rather than revolution, which is that drones are changing the dynamics of warfare as we see them on the modern battlefield, but they aren't doing away with the need for existing equipment. The use of drones on battlefield doesn't mean that you're not going to need tanks or artillery systems or other more traditional weapon systems. This means that any perceived carbon savings that you might have from using more drones in the battlefield because you would charge them with a battery are sort of redundant because they complement existing military capabilities rather than do away with them. So in absolute terms, you would probably be adding to the carbon footprint of militaries by also needing these new drone capabilities. And the fourth point is very much related to the supply chain. The sort of global supply chain really has an impact too. The products and input goods that go into making a lot of these drones are highly carbon intensive. I mean, carbon fiber is more than 10 times as carbon intensive as steel is. And the grand scale that you want to have these drones in, the idea and conceptualization of a drone swarm, means that you need a lot of these materials to go about setting up drone units, etc. Which means that in the grand scheme of things, even though an individual drone might have a smaller carbon footprint than, say, a tank or a fighter jet, the scale that you need them at will still come at a steep carbon cost. And funnily enough, this supply chain discussion we found also ties into wider discussions, especially in Europe, on discussions of de-risking. Specifically, and it's also been mentioned before, who do we want to buy a lot of these technologies from? Who do we want to buy a lot of this equipment from? Especially a lot of the civilian UAVs that are used in Ukraine, for example. They are in large part produced in China, which means that you have a foreign reliance for a lot of the capabilities, a lot of the technology that's being developed, especially in this space, doesn't necessarily come from suppliers that you might be happy with having or that you might want to diversify, which is another complicated set of issues. Some further considerations that really are also beginning to emerge in this study of ours is really the sort of snowball effect that comes from having drones prevalent on battlefields, that now that you have drones, you also need to have countermeasures to deal with having drones. That means that you have an indirect increased environmental impact due to sort of the countermeasures that you need. You need to have more electronic warfare. You need reinforcement cages, wire netting to protect infrastructure and, critical infrastructure and assets. That implicitly also has a certain cost to it and also makes things more expensive. Class 1 UAVs the smaller UAVs that we've looked at, are more predisposed to difficult adaptation for climate change, mainly due to their size from an extreme weather perspective, more so than larger drones like Class 2 or 3 platforms, mainly due to the materials that they're comprised of, how they're fueled, but also the size of them. And this has an impact too. And then finally, as we looked into, is that there might be an impact from temperatures produced by climate change in terms of the energy that's required to generate lift for some drones, that it might be marginal in terms of the energy that you need, but if it reduces the range by a given set of meters or kilometers, then that's also something that needs to be taken into account for when you conduct operations. And finally, for a quick summarization of the points, is that there's sort of a dual pressure of climate change and the use of UAVs in modern conflicts that creates a complex loop with potential long-term consequences. They impact one another in distinct ways, but the loop that exists is that drones will increase the carbon footprint of militaries in indeterminate ways, while simultaneously also being impacted by a warming climate. Drones also do present immediate operational opportunities for militaries, but their life cycle environmental costs are quite materially intensive. You do need a lot of goods and energy that goes into making a lot of these carbon fiber frames for drones. And that's not something that's easily solvable. And it also varies depending on where you produce them. They might be more carbon intensive to produce in a certain location like China rather than in Europe. And finally, that the methodological approach that we've used here sort of did provide us with a robust framework for evaluating this relationship, but we did find significant limitations in terms of the available public information on drones. Specifically, not just military models, but also civilian models. It's not easy to figure out exactly what components of different materials go into making these drones. For proprietary reasons, civilian companies don't want to share that information. It's a very competitive industry, and by doing so, they'd expose themselves to their competitors. Simultaneously, from a military perspective, a lot of this information is classified for obvious reasons. Also adds a layer of difficulty in actually assessing these wider impacts. So while we can make some general assessments onto the impact that drones have on the environment and vis-a-vis environment on drones, it still becomes very difficult to actually target it, determine what these impacts are with the limited information available. Thank you.
Excellent. I think that's a really key point about some of those technological trends and really how the changing dynamics, but also some really well-made points about the depth of the supply chain vulnerabilities and assumptions. And Donna, you must have been thinking when Tanisha closed with a "let's predict the future" quote as well. It's last but not least that we turn to Donna Dupont, founder and chief strategist at Purple Compass. And Donna is an award-winning futurist who works across sectors to develop foresight skills, particularly around navigating uncertainty and risk. And so, Donna, we look forward to your comments about how we integrate climate intelligence and how we prepare for what comes next.
Thank you. And thank you, Bruno and team, for organizing this event. I'm really excited to be part of this panel, and I've learned a fair bit just from my colleagues here from the presentations. So I am on the practitioner side of foresight and futures. I've worked on a variety of projects ranging from international development to crisis response, policing, and organized crime projects, space sector, and then defense. So a lot of the cross-cutting issues that affect all these sectors is climate change and enhancing their intelligence. A lot of these organizations are very, have traditional models of forecasting, and so they are interested in foresight. So this presentation is a paper that I'm working on. It's still work in progress, but it's trying to understand what climate intelligence looks like in the context of climate change. So I'm starting with this concept that's been mentioned many times around climate change is known as a threat multiplier. We've heard that many times. But what does this actually look like and mean from a systems point of view? And so this is where I started my analysis. I pulled a variety of different information that had case studies from around the world of consequences of climate-related impacts. And specifically, I was looking at system dynamics. How did they describe it? And there were a lot of really rich information on the actual dynamics, and I wanted to understand that. So within the analysis, three main intersecting domains came up, and we'll go into detail a little bit in each one. The first one was around power competition, and it's the intersection of climate, geopolitics, and fragile state nexus, so those three intersections. The second was around green minerals and economics, geopolitics, and again, fragile state nexus. And the last one was resource scarcity, food, water, energy nexus. This is not meant to be a comprehensive analysis of all of the issues, but more about what were some of the dominant topics that came up and to understand these dynamics. So I'm going to go into very briefly, because I know we don't have a lot of time, but the first one, which is really unraveling the knot of complexity for the first climate nexus, which is really power competition. And you can see from this, it's kind of a messy system because it's a dynamic system. It's not static. There are a lot of feedback loops here that are compounding. If you look at the number one, you're going to see a vicious loop where you have climate change drivers impacting fragile states, and you have a vicious loop of responding to crisis, slow recovery, and increasing vulnerability. And that increasing vulnerability can create instability, leading to the second loop below, where these can have a variety of different cascading consequences on the civil security side. And it just depends on the state's ability to be able to recover, and also the governance, right? You can see some of the topics that come up here around resource shortages, migration comes up. And so with this type of instability, it can lead to weakening of state capacity, which you see is 3, which is another vicious loop, which breaks down governance, can break down economics, energy, geopolitics, and all this is just a cascading loop of potential vulnerability that can open up for state actors or non-state actors to leverage opportunity for influence and power. And that's where you see the 4th loop. So the idea behind this is to take the 30,000-foot view from a systems point of view to understand where are the dynamics, what's driving, can we slow down the drivers, where do we need to balance, where's a leverage point? And so that where we can take action, where simple actions can actually have significant effects. So that's the thinking behind this. And this is an iterative process of inquiry. So the reason we make it visual is simply because then we can step back and we can ask more questions, because this is a systems of systems type of challenge. So this gets me into the second loop, which is really around green minerals. And again, it's a very messy system, but you can see here with green energy technology being a driver, you've got number 1, where you've got this demand and supply of green minerals, right? And there's a variety of different types of minerals that fit that description, and I'm sure it's evolving. But what it does is it does lead to actions in the system for extraction, which can create some vulnerabilities, in current territories that have a lot of these minerals, and that can lead to civil security challenges. And so it depends on the strength of the governance. Again, this also can lead to conflict as well, right? So not just intrastate, but interstate conflict. And that creates a lot of instability. That conflict can be used. There can be a preemptive or resource strategy to amplify tensions in this type of trade war type of situation. So that, again, adds some more instability. And then if you add in opportunities for new territories caused by climate change, like the Arctic, then this opens up different ecosystems where now you are having a competition for control and interstate disputes. So again, it's a systems of systems. So the idea is to step back and saying, okay, where can we intersect to help balance the system, whether it's reducing vulnerability, bringing, maybe slowing down the drivers in some areas, but it's an opportunity to have discussion. And so these are framings to help identify challenges that can be formed into scenarios for deeper strategic conversations. So the last one is really focused on the resource scarcity of food, water, energy nexus. I won't go to all the details here because I know we're time constrained, but you can see it's the same pattern of different types of vicious loops compounding, leading to conflict, vulnerability, and challenging governance. Right? So, and the strength of governance becomes very important. And so how do we maintain stability? But you can also see that each one of these, when you have this kind of stability in a system, you are opening up to different actors, including organized crime. And this can be potential opportunities where there is a lot of breakdown in governance, where organized crime can take hold. So, what does all that mean? Well, I wanted to understand the system, to understand some of those basic patterns that need to be part of any type of conversation around futures and different areas we want to explore. But I also wanted to compare it to just how we anticipate in defense and security. And so this is a quick summary of just anticipatory from a traditional threat perspective versus anticipating for emerging risk, which has new information and is more unstable. And so these are different types of focus, different types of data, different types of horizon scanning and risk framing. And you can see when you look at futures, you are looking more to the medium to long term. It is more of a strategic lens of what is emerging from a systems point of view. You are interested in cascading risks and the impact to human and national security as well. And the methodologies are quite different because it looks at horizon scanning, scenario planning, and vulnerability mapping as part of that. And really, at the end of the day, the decision making is different. So it's not an either or. Each set, whether you're anticipating traditional or you're looking at emerging, it's about bridging the two because they're providing unique information. One would be more short-term, immediate, based on geopolitical adversaries and homeland and defense and security. And the other one is more, when you look at futures, it's about interdependency, resiliency, it's a societal vulnerability, and opportunities for action. So this is just some common blind spots that came up, that identified in the research. And a lot of it has to do with recognizing whether you're looking at the system from a siloed perspective or from a holistic perspective. And it's about where you draw the boundary, and there is zooming in and zooming out. So you want to be able to do both, but it's understanding patterns and interactions, and also it's how you work with deep uncertainty. A lot of traditional frameworks, they want certainty, so it's more probabilistic, but foresight is looking at deep uncertainty, and there's methodologies to be able to help with that. And again, the underlying vulnerability, instability, and governance considerations are critical to any type of scenario because these are the opportunities for exploitation and conflict. On the interpreting side, you can see that there's a lot of new type of thinking capabilities, systems thinking and futures thinking that help to understand slow-moving long-term risks and complex causal pathways, and how to use systems thinking to understand leverage points and archetypal patterns. Also, weak signals of change and understanding what's emerging that doesn't have a strong evidence base, but we know based on information, and we're understanding the potentiality of where that can go. So this wraps up into the preliminary ideas around a climate intelligence framework, and that will be the next step of taking some of these insights. But key elements when you're putting together a framework, important aspects, really look at where there are opportunities for multilateral cooperation and action, because this is global and it needs to be, you need to look at where those opportunities exist, especially in this type of geopolitical situation, where there are opportunities for collective intelligence across partners. So we're talking about international development partners that might be more on the ground with helping with vulnerability, to crisis responders, to law enforcement and defense. They'll each have a different lens and understanding. Where can we partner with fusion centers for intelligence sharing? What might be helpful but also challenging given the current geopolitical environment? Are there opportunities for civil-military interaction and cooperation? And a lot of the analysis should be focused on is around the compounding vulnerabilities and how we can build resiliency. So below are just some ideas around the foresight piece, around bridging anticipatory systems. And it's really about, are there opportunities to establish partnerships and start to build a climate intelligence horizon scanning capability that brings in different contexts, but also can then aggregate information so we can look at common patterns, but we look at also regional variations. And then from there, we could understand potential emerging issues, potentiality for disruption, which could then be helpful to then identify plausible scenarios to provoke strategic conversations around uncertainty and robust strategy. But also, there's also the transformation element to this. And as much as we want to anticipate the future, we also need to decide our agency for change and what our values are and our principles going forward and our system goals, and what we want to invest in and start to build toward that. And sometimes that becomes the starting point, and understanding the changing landscape becomes how do we navigate around the disruption but still maintain our North Star forward for transformation. So I'm going to end with this quote that I love by Peter Drucker around turbulence. And it's the greatest danger in times of turbulence is not the turbulence, but it's acting with yesterday's logic. And so we are in a time of continuous learning and unlearning and relearning, and we need to be open to that and what's emerging and how that might change our point of view and the actions and our decisions moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you all for excellent presentations and great questions, and to the audience for their great questions and engagement, and to Bruno for putting together, and the CSAC team, an excellent panel. I think there's more to be said on the legal and ethical. It could create a panel in itself, I think, for when we look at sort of future conversations.